Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Q4 BDO Manufacturing Outlook webinar today. I'm Richard Austin, BDO's National Head of Manufacturing. For our webinar today, we're delighted to be joined by Make UK's Director of Policy and Engagement, Ben Fletcher, and their Senior Economist, James Broome. Ben and James will be providing an update on the state of UK manufacturing and sharing the findings from our latest BDO and Make UK Manufacturing Outlook report. After that, we'll be following up with an update from our BDO experts. So we have Oliver Back, who's a partner and contract and commercial risk practice lead, and he'll be with Nick Eggett, one of our supply chain risk leads, to talk about contracting, supply chain and supplier management. We'll also be hearing from Juliet Woolwork, who's our Customs and Duty Director, talking about customs, and then we have Julia McCullough joining us, who's our tax partner, to talk about international tax and transfer pricing. The presentation will be followed by a live Q&A. Please submit any questions you have through the Q&A functionality, and we'll pick these up at the end. And just so you know, we will be recording this webinar today, and we'll follow up with the recording and slides over the next couple of days. So with that, I will hand over to Ben Fletcher from Make UK.
Thank you very much, Richard, and it's an absolute pleasure to join everyone today. We've got plenty to cover. No one at the moment is opportunity constrained by things to discuss. I'm just going to give you a quick, brief sort of summary of what we're picking up from our engagement with government and the big opposition parties, as a sort of piece of wider context, and James will take you through the data which has helped inform this Q4 outlook, which has already got quite a lot of media coverage. It's extremely topical and extremely relevant, and I think in relation to a number of issues, manufacturing continues to be a very significant political consideration in the context of both COVID and the Brexit deal. And those are probably the two areas where I will kick off. We have been doing a lot of work with government, also talking to the big opposition parties, and starting very briefly with COVID in regard to its relevance to the outlook for manufacturing over the next few months and years. Government is now, as is blindingly obvious, incredibly focused on the challenge that the second wave is posing, the fact that many hospitals in parts of the country are at levels that were last felt back in March and April, but we're still not close to the peak of this wave yet, and obviously a lot of concern and nervousness about the current plans for Christmas and the implications that that will have on the healthcare system in the new year. The manufacturing position on this is initially quite positive. We've had some very, very good briefing over the last 24 hours on, yet again, the amazing things that British manufacturing has done to step up to help with things like the supply of PPE. And we now have a very strong PPE capability in the UK. We no longer have a shortage. And there's been a terrific amount of good work done with government and the sector to bring that work back into the UK. And also where there are things we can't yet do in the UK, get better supply lines into other supply markets. But outside of that, there continues to be a real challenge. And if we were to have an extended second wave, possibly even a third wave next year before the full benefit of the vaccine kicks in, we continue to have real concerns about the aviation sector, the automotive sector, where demand is already very, very low, just starting to pick up again. But if we have more restrictions, it's not about the production capability. Production in all sectors can continue and has continued, even at the very worst parts of the pandemic, but it has an incredibly suppressing effect on demand. We've spoken to people in the commercial vehicle sector who simply don't have a single order on their order book, very, very big names in the production of commercial vehicles, buses as well as HGVs, coaches as well. And in the vehicle sector, no companies are renewing their fleets at the moment. And the longer this pandemic goes, the more significant the impact will be. What we've started to get just slightly is some indication that government recognises that the furlough scheme alone doesn't solve all the problems in those sectors. And we're going to continue to push on that, because it now is increasingly looking like the problems that we face will run for a bit longer. In terms of the EU deal, there's a huge amount that we could get into in terms of speculation and challenge. We're talking to very senior and very well-placed sources in a number of different areas, both in government, in international governments across Europe, and also very well-placed former diplomatic sources who've got a good insight into the negotiation. The challenge is, with all of that insight, is that you can really read into it whatever you want. It's pretty clear from all of our intelligence, and the media is broadly in the same space, that of all the big issues, to badly quote George Orwell, one issue is more important than others, even though they're all equal. There's definitely a first among equals, and that's the level playing field. We're starting to detect movement on both sides, and some of the media reporting of this has been, again, pretty accurate. I think the challenge is that if you're an optimist, you see this as a pathway to a deal, and if you're a pessimist, what you see is both sides making pragmatic concessions so that when it eventually collapses, they can both say it was the other side's fault because they were very flexible and they were very reasonable. And I think the real issue for us in the sector is that we have an ongoing situation, which in some cases may even reach into next year and beyond the 31st of December deadline. I think that's unlikely, but not impossible. But we have an ongoing situation of uncertainty. And one of the things that we may talk about later, and I'm sure we'll talk about on further webinars into next year, is the impact that that's having on confidence, and in particular the confidence to invest, which is particularly stark at the moment. So business confidence is very, very low. The things that we're picking up from members are really worrying. We have a very, very consistent message from firms that can do so, that they're already planning to move as little as possible in January to either freeze production, extend Christmas shutdowns, or simply not take orders that have a January fulfillment if the end market is in the EU, because there is no confidence that the border systems are going to work at the start of the year, and people want things to bed in before they take a gamble on them. There's lots of real challenges about confidence in investment. There's a significant challenge with companies with overseas parents not really even prepared to consider investment decisions until there is some certainty about the way ahead. So I think the EU deal, you can read it either way if you're an optimist or a pessimist. I'm not going to play Mystic Meg here. The one thing that does seem to be consistent is that people think that it will benefit everybody for this to run on a little bit longer. As I said, that may even stretch into next year, but for a variety of reasons, it doesn't suit anybody from what we're picking up from multiple sources for this to end today or tomorrow. You can then place your own bets on how long that piece of string is, but there's certainly a political advantage in doing so. And just to put some of that in context from what we're picking up from our conversations beyond the government, we have a lot of nervousness about what this deal will actually deliver. If you are a hardline looking for no deal type person, if there is a deal, then it certainly will have elements of it that you will not be happy with. And this is part of the reason why the negotiations going on help, because it minimises the amount of time for parliamentary scrutiny. Certainly, if you believe that we're heading towards no deal, then, as I said earlier, the government will want to make sure that they can show that they did everything they could to try and get a deal before giving up. This is against the Westminster backdrop, where the government has had significant backbench rebellions on its COVID tiering mechanisms, where it cannot be certain that even with a majority of 80, if the opposition plays hardball, it cannot be certain that it can get absolutely everything through that it wants. And if it does a deal which outrages members of the European Research Group and some of the Brexit hardliners, then it's trying to do so in a very febrile Westminster environment. We also understand that the SNP have said that they will vote against the deal even before they've seen it, on the basis that it will not be a good enough deal. And also, I think, with a very clear eye to the Scottish Parliament elections in May of next year, they do not want to align themselves with any deal done by the current administration, and they wish to put some very clear water between them and what they say will be a very damaging outcome for Scotland. So we have some of those politics playing out, and we also have a challenge for the Labour Party, which is if a deal is done, if they vote against it, it will allow the current government to portray them as archetypal Remainers who aren't prepared to move on and are not prepared to act in the national interest. If they vote for it, they have a real fear, or certainly some elements of the Labour Party have a real fear that, as they have done on other issues, including Scottish independence, they will have aligned themselves far too close with the current government, and what may well, once people really get into the detail, prove to be a very damaging deal for the UK economy. So the atmosphere in Westminster is very febrile. The environment that the government are trying to handle these two pressures, both COVID and EU exit, is very difficult. And it certainly is clear that optics and the way things look are equally important as the practical issues of what people decide and what is in any deal, because those optics are going to be really critical for getting the necessary support to follow any policy and any process, whether it's more restrictive COVID tiering or whether it's a no deal exit or a trade deal, which will probably not please people on either side of the argument. So an incredibly challenging time. Manufacturing's got to make decisions and build its way through all of that. And we're extremely concerned about how we begin that process. We have absolute confidence that the sector will ultimately thrive, but the challenge is how much pressure does the sector have to cope with at the start of next year, and what will be the starting point for our rebuilding process into 2021. I'll now hand over to James, who will take you through the data, and we'd be delighted to take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you all through our Q4 results of 2020 manufacturing outlook. What I'll start with is a brief overview, and then we'll get into some of the meat of the metrics. But overall, it's a mixed bag. It's the end of the crashing of the metrics that we've witnessed in this research over in Q2 and Q3. Yet the medium-term outlook does remain bleak and arguably worsened as recovery gets pushed into the distance somewhat. Output and orders have improved, but still substantially below historic averages. And the forward-looking export picture has declined ahead of the imminent EU exit, and especially within the motor vehicle sector and in the associated supply chains in that industry. The investment picture has improved, but it is now negative for 3 quarters, and this is a systemic problem now. The subdued investment that actually predates the coronavirus pandemic and is only being exacerbated by it. The employment data suggests that redundancies, or the majority of redundancies, have already taken place by the wind up of the first iteration of the JRS, indicating that this second JRS, we won't see such a floodgate of redundancies at the end of it, as many manufacturers have indicated that they've completed their staffing reduction processes. But combining all this, our manufacturing forecast for 2021 has been downgraded, and quite significantly, due to this view that the V-shaped recovery, as it was so decried, is looking far slower, and it's going to be pushed specifically within the manufacturing sector far more down the line into 2021 and into 2022 as well. Just before I go into the metrics, just to temper them, in any given year previously in this survey's 30-year history, the marginal negativity we're seeing, we would see as quite a bad result. But now we're against the backdrop of incredibly negative numbers in Q2 and Q3 this year. These results seem quite mild and give a moment's optimism. And we'll see this if we move on to the next slide, please. We'll see here, we've got the global financial crash on the far right, and we've got Q2 and Q3 just 2 steps to the left of it. And we can see how severe it was. And it was actually, in fact, worse than the global financial crisis in terms of output and orders. And we see there in Q4, just on the last colored bar on the right, we can see it isn't still negative, but it's come a long, long way from Q2 and Q3. So really, at the very least, what it shows is that businesses reported the same or better, but at least no more businesses reported worse conditions. And it does indicate a turning point and does mark the end of that extreme bleed in orders and output that we've endured in the past 2 quarters. And the next slide, please. Now, export performance has seen a similar end to the negative bleed orders has been experiencing, yet expectations for the start of next year are ominously worse. And this negative expectation is certainly a result of 2021 Q1, i.e. the first quarter of next year, representing the first business quarter under which there'll be a new and still to some degree currently unknown trading relationship with the EU. And as Ben was mentioning earlier, many businesses reporting to us that there's going to be a very slow start to January, as certain businesses choose to watch really what happens in terms of the operational challenges around exporting goods to the European Union at the very start of that new arrangement. The next slide, please. In our sectoral focus, and due to the nature of the headline figure being somewhat close to zero in terms of balance of change, such is the case for many of manufacturing's constituent parts and the subsectors. However, a notable standout here in this selection is the rubber and plastic subsector, who have reported a balance of change figure about 40% down in terms of last quarter and output down at minus 20%. And one thing that's not on this chart is the very worrying performance of the motor vehicle sector that has seen the worst decline in output over the year. Not done very well this quarter, but over the year as well. Now we're at the end of Q4, we can assess the total year's performance and expecting some degree of bounce back in 2021. However, that is the subsector that is suffering the most and is likely most infamously directly impacted by the potential threat of tariffs by the new relationship in the new year. Next slide, please. What this fourth quarter marks and what this chart shows, just to give it a context, is where, when we ask manufacturers, where are you experiencing new export demand, if any, we ask them to rank where that demand's coming from, whether it's Asia, European, or North American. And now, for this fourth quarter marks a shift back to the normal, which is that US demand leads the pack for new export demand. But in Q3, what we saw was Asian demand lead for the first time in a very long time. And really what this reflected was the pandemic's global lag effect from east to west, as Asian markets were far, far further through their pandemic recovery process than Western markets. And Western markets were really just sort of grappling with the worst of it at that time. And what this reassuringly shows is now we're back to Western market demand, i.e. North America in this case, leading again. It shows that these Western markets are now within the manufacturing supply chain sector are now operational in a level in terms of the demand flows to what we saw prior to the pandemic. So there's a silver lining there to interpret. Next slide, please. Now, this chart looks very similar to the output and orders chart I showed you at the start, but what these bars represent is future expectations for the coming quarter. So what we see here is that output's expected slightly to be up while orders down. However, as you can see on the far right, the shifts are very slight, and one would be able to consider this a no change prognosis. However, despite this no change prognosis, another silver lining is that another heavy fall is not expected by manufacturers in the immediate first quarter of 2021, despite there being a lot of headwind, including the EU exit and the risk of subsequent lockdowns and potential further waves and disruptions related around the pandemic. So a no change prognosis here is actually rather heartening, despite the knowledge of the challenges to come. Next slide, please. This latest survey shows a balance of 2% of manufacturers have reported UK prices to have increased despite low inflation. And this is explained by the increase in demand for electronic goods this quarter, which reported the largest positive balance, which is up 27%, of manufacturers seeing an increase in domestic prices. However, in contrast, export prices remain in a negative balance and partially dominated by the downward pressures originating from the poor performance of the basic metals and chemical goods sectors in this regard in terms of export prices. However, over the next 3 months, which is on the far right of the chart here, manufacturers expect prices and UK margins to improve, but export margins, largely unsurprisingly, to worsen, especially in the immediate first quarter of next year, where we see manufacturers having to adjust prices of their products to remain desirable and competitive in the European market, depending on how the view and availability of customers within the EU find UK products on the turn of the new year. Next slide, please. But despite all this, confidence is ticking quite upward. And all regions and nations reported a slight improvement in their business confidence. And the exceptions for this are the East Midlands, East of England, and South West. However, they had overinflated confidence last quarter, arguably. But the overall increase in confidence across the UK this quarter reflects both the position manufacturers find themselves in currently, which is in almost all cases operational to at least some degree, and their expectations for next quarter being less dire than one might expect given the circumstance the industry finds itself in on the back of two very, very negative quarters in Q2 and Q3. Nonetheless, although these expectations indicate an improvement next quarter for the figures, balance figures in terms of the metrics of output orders and so on are still expected to remain negative in the first quarter of Q1. So the industry is unlikely to enjoy that outright positive balance figures at the start of the new year. However, the confidence ticking up really does reflect businesses' acclimatization to the circumstance now it's been protracted for so long, and also the hope that the worst of it is over in terms of the bleeder metrics, and that's reflected in both our quantitative charts on the tracking of things like orders and output as well. Next slide, please. And here we have again a similar trend, and this is employment and investment, employment being the bar and investment intentions being the line. And what we see here is a similar trend to our other metrics that, while still negative, both are ticking upwards in almost equal measure, still remain in negative territory. And as I was saying earlier, in any normal year, we'd say those are quite negative figures, but we have hope at the end of this quarter that seeing upwards trends across the board indicates that we're moving in the right direction. And if we move on to the next slide, please, as well, and show that this just combines our output chart with the investment chart, and see there, just to hammer that point in, that they're trending at the same sort of time and direction. And that's important because if investment's not matched, it's far less likely to be a very short-lived bubble, because that underlying investment needs to be there to make sure that that growth and that output growth is sustainable and can be continued. And so that is a positive feature moving into the next year for sustainable output growth, and not to see a sudden spike as manufacturing starts up, but then finds new challenges in the immediate term of the new year. And next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned in the very first slide, our forecasts, though, they have been downgraded, especially in 2021. So the red bar represents our manufacturing output forecast, and orange our UK GDP. Now, for the end of this year, we have a clear sight of the picture, and we can see that minus 12% for manufacturing, slightly worse than overall economy, the minus 11.3. But the real point to look at here is 2.7% growth in 2021, but 5.4% overall economy growth. So that's suggesting that manufacturing is going to recover in next year about half as fast as that of overall service economy. Now, this phenomenon isn't necessarily unique to the pandemic, as after any major crisis, the manufacturing sector has a greater lag effect on it to restart. It's very capital intensive for manufacturers to restart, and to use such an analogy, it's far harder for the manufacturing sector to turn the light switch back on, which might be easier in terms of seeing GVA figures recover within the services sector. However, in this case, this is not going to remain, all things being equal, into 2022 and 2023, as the rate will pick up as manufacturing industry gets ahead of steam up and the supply chains get adjusted to the new relationship, particularly with the largest export partner, the EU. So not a massive cause for concern, that gap. However, forecast has been downgraded by half compared to our previous quarters, and that's just generally with the whole economy recovery being protracted further. And that's in line with the Office of Budget Responsibilities updated forecast that see our UK GDP recovery being pushed further into 2021, as perhaps metrics were a little optimistic earlier in the year in terms of the speed of that recovery. So the next slide, please. I'll end there. And this is just a review, very same slide as the first one I showed you. And I'll hand you back over to Val. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. And if we now hand over to Oliver Bath, please.
Thank you, Belle. Thanks, James, and good afternoon, everyone. As you can see here, we've got a panel of BDO presenters to talk to you around, broadly speaking, around supply chain, with a number of different facets to it. It is a very broad-ranging topic, so we won't be able to cover everything. But what we've done is just select a few of the topic areas which we're seeing particularly resonate with our clients at the moment. So Nick Eggert and I will shortly just talk around supply chain resilience and broader contract and supply management considerations before handing over to Juliet Woolwork to discuss the customs side of things. And then last but not least, over to Julian McCullough to talk about international tax and transfer pricing. So as you would have heard from Ben and James, there's a really rich backdrop of data now, which is kind of showing what the impact has been over the last 3 quarters, and also some indications around what uncertainty we might be having to address in the near term and beyond, with Brexit looming large. Now, what we've seen within our clients is that between March and around about September, October time, the vast majority of activity was purely focused on how to react and build resilience in relation to the pandemic. And then gradually over that month, it switched very much to focusing on Brexit. And I think what we're really trying to get across here is that there are a number of interconnected factors at play here, which all need to be taken in consideration in the round, rather than just looked at in isolation, because of the fact that we've got a number of running streams which really do impact supply chains as well as the broader economic environment. So before I hand over to Nick, I think one thing to mention, based upon our experience of what our clients have been doing, is that since March we've seen quite a significant uptake in broadening out supply chains more generally. So that has involved quite a lot of rapid onboarding of new suppliers, both to build resilience within the supply chain, and added that to the economic environment where the risk of business failure is substantially heightened. That there's a huge amount of uncertainty across supply chains generally at the moment. So I'll hand over to Nick now to talk about what we can do to help build resilience throughout that supply chain, and then I'll go on to get into some more specifics around contracts and contract management. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Ollie. Good afternoon, everyone. So I just want to have a sort of a run through some thoughts and some ideas that have been born out of the experience that Ollie's described regarding our clients and the trend to build resilience into supply chains. And by that, companies are increasing their working inventory, their materials in the supply chain. And so that's one way of doing it. But I want to talk about building resilience internally within that supply chain. So understanding where the points of pressure are, where the points of key risk are, and how you can be well placed to deal with them in a way that perhaps many companies weren't prior to COVID. And that's not just COVID. COVID was an unusual, unexpected event, but generally there are surveys and reports out there indicating that over half of companies don't really understand their supply chain sufficiently well to respond to disruptions. And as a supply chain person, I like to think there are 3 certainties in life. Those are death, taxes, and supply chain disruptions. The first 2 we can do nothing about, but in terms of supply chain disruptions, the impact of that on a company is obviously its cost and reputation, it's lost revenue, cost to put things right, loss of customer dissatisfaction and moving on, opportunities for competitors to take the business that has been lost or is vulnerable through those supply chain disruptions. And so really it's about understanding what you can do, but focusing your effort in the right areas. And so the first things what we like to think about is what is a business critical supplier to you, and this can be driven by any number of things. Often it's about the level of spend with a supplier, it's about the level of revenue that raw material or product generates. It could be that, but also it could be something that impacts on how your competitive advantage, your differentiation point is is based upon. It could be brand, it could be quality, it could be anything, but it will be very contextual and very specific to you. And so it's worth understanding what that is, because once you've understood what that is, you can then work backwards and understand the elements within your supply chain that support that. And there are many examples that you're probably aware of where, you know, a seemingly insignificant component can derail the most complex manufacturing process that exists. Boeing is an example where they had to stop production of the Dreamliners for want of some very low cost fastenings that they then ended up going down to the local supermarket to acquire. Once you've understood the complexity of your product set and what the risk, where the risk might manifest itself, and that includes with third-party providers, it's worth understanding what your supply chain it looks like, both in geographical terms, where the flows are. Do you have a number of suppliers that all flow back to a single point? Do you have geographical exposure, things like that, and what exposures, what risks are you vulnerable to? There's a lot of regulatory and regulation legislation coming through now, corporate criminal offences, modern slavery. There have been reports recently of impact on supply chain for workers working in sweatshops in the Midlands, for instance. What are your suppliers doing? How resilient are your suppliers? If they went out of business, how would you cope? What is their ownership structure? Are these people you want to do business with? And that sort of flows back to what the key value drivers are. When considering what the whether your suppliers are resilient, and that doesn't just mean going out of business. It might mean that some of their production facilities fall over. Are you aware of their business continuity planning, their business resilience planning? Because this is all about making sure that you can react as quickly as you can in the fastest time possible. Do you know how reliant they are on you for your revenue? And similarly, where do you sit in that supply chain? Do you rely on a single customer, for instance? And these factors all combine and come together to form a rich picture that can support your risk assessment and help you focus your efforts. And just thinking about some of the consequences of COVID, there's a lot of conversation about onshoring and nearshoring suppliers to make up for the disruption, or to compensate or protect yourself against the disruption that was experienced in the first part of the COVID reaction. But as a supply chain risk manager, to me, all that is doing, if you think of your supply chain and you are part of somebody else's supply chain, you think of that as the system, all you're doing is bringing your horizon closer, and so what is behind that is moving further away. So it's worth considering, actually, yes, the immediate problem might be solved, but are you creating more friction, more risk exposure behind that? And these are sort of, it's not exhaustive. There are many factors, and it will certainly be contextual to your situation, but these are all things we can think about to help provide you with that opportunity to react faster, minimize the cost, protect reputation, and build in that resilience. Ollie.
Great, thank you, Nick. And just following on from that, the supply chain considerations that Nick's been talking through, the vast majority of those supplier relationships will inherently be underpinned by a contractual agreement. Whether we're talking about materials, contract manufacturing, or something more vanilla and back office like IT managed services, there will all be specifics buried within the contract, which will be of commercial and general business operation relevance to you. So I think the first thing, in light of the upcoming Brexit uncertainty and also the broader economic backdrop, is really understanding what risk transfers have occurred within your main agreements. Now, you may have thousands and thousands of contracts within your business, and it may not be appropriate to try and trawl through every one of those, but certainly for your business critical and your higher value contracts, it's really worthwhile understanding what your position is with regards to some of these points. You know, the basic ones such as foreign exchange. So with FX fluctuations, who bears the ultimate cost of that? Is that something that would fall on you, or something you can push onto customers, or has to be eaten by your suppliers? Obviously, depending on the outcome, whether we get a deal or a no deal and the nature of it, there will inherently be an impact to a greater or lesser extent on the currency markets. So again, it's just something which you'll need to bear in mind, which no doubt you will have already. But the same goes for tariffs. So, you know, again, we don't really have a clear picture at this stage with, 2 to 3 weeks to go, of what tariffs might be in play. And, you know, if you think about how long they've got left until the 31st of December, and will we actually get any particular transition period after that to adjust, is unclear at this stage. So you really need to know what your kind of scenario plans and borders would look like there. Again, we touched very, very briefly on border delays. We've seen in the news with the likes of Honda and IKEA over the last couple of days that border disruptions are real, and they're having a significant impact. So, you know, what is your risk around that? What activities have you undertaken to try and circumvent that wherever possible? And also, whose responsibility is it to make sure that those delays don't disrupt the ultimate performance of the contract? There are a few others on there which I could go into, but I'm kind of getting conscious of time. I think one main thing is to make sure that if you're entering into new agreements, make sure that you're giving them flexibility to adapt with any future changes. Obviously, coming out of the EU, we'll now have an extra jurisdiction, new laws, new tariffs, which will, you know, potentially be quite volatile over the next few decades. Within your contracts, it's always good to make sure that you've got the right language in there to enable you to rebaseline the contract or the pricing mechanisms as and when those changes in laws and policies take place. With regards to termination and renegotiation, again, it just follows on from understanding what the key risk transfers are and what exposures you might have, but also what options you might have through your supply chain. So if your key supplier is unable to provide the services that they're contractually obliged to do you have any options to look to exit that contract, or at the very least look to use it as an opportunity to renegotiate your relationship? I might come on a bit later to talk about this particular area, but, you know, again, this is very much understanding what your contractual position is. We're not necessarily recommending that you go down the route of enforcing it to the letter, as we've seen with COVID. Organizations that have, yes, they've understood their position, but actually they've adopted a more collaborative approach across the value chain, have definitely benefited from that approach. So we would certainly expect the same to be the case with regards to dealing with Brexit uncertainty. The final area I just wanted to touch on with regards to contract, and hopefully you'll have noticed the one-line quote there from World Contracting and Commerce, which is poor contract management costs companies the equivalent of 9% of revenue. Now, this was based upon a 2017 study of around 500 businesses across all sectors, all sizes globally. And the conclusions that they came to was that, you know, as you see there, weaknesses in contract management do have quite a material impact on the bottom line. So especially with regards to Brexit and COVID uncertainty, the broader economic environment, there's a real opportunity to build resilience into your business by making sure that you're managing your contracts and getting the right commercial outcomes from them. So what does that look like? Again, you know, the most basic area of that is making sure that compliance is happening within your agreements. But actually, it's also making sure that you as an organization are using those contracts in the most commercially efficient way. And also, particularly with long-term, very high value, high complexity agreements, quite often what was agreed to on day one, 5 or 6 years down the line and beyond, is no longer really representative of what either party need or are indeed delivering. So there's a real opportunity to take a look at some of those agreements and understand whether or not you can rebaseline or renegotiate just to drive better outcomes. And that can often be a win-win for both sides. It doesn't necessarily have to be a win-loss. So I think that's probably all I'll say on that front, given the time. And I think I'll now hand over to Juliet to talk about customs.
Thank you, Ollie. Top priorities for businesses then, for customs perspective, with which with, as we said, 2 to 3 weeks to go. So first of all, to make sure that you have got the right registration numbers. So these are the EORI numbers. These are your unique trader reference numbers. You will need these to import and export as of 1 Jan. Second thing is understand your supply chain and distribution channels, particularly from an Incoterms perspective. For those of you who aren't familiar with these are terms which determine when the responsibility, the cost and the risk for moving goods passes from the seller to the buyer. But what they also include and what they also cover is which party has to do the customs declaration. So check your Incoterms. It's not just about the physical movement of the goods, it also covers your regulatory obligations from a customs declaration perspective. You also need to consider, once you've identified who the importer or the exporter is in your supply chain, is if they can meet the new customs establishment criteria. And by this, I mean that both the UK and the EU have, in the UK's sense, introduced legislation, in the EU sense, enforced it, who can be an importer and exporter. There are restrictions. There are requirements about establishment in either country, not just VAT registration. And in particular, if you are using the Incoterms Ex-Works or DDP, you may find that you face these restrictions. It won't necessarily be plain sailing. So make sure you understand what your obligations and risks are. Now, normally, it is still the case that most importers and exporters use a third party, like a clearing agent or a freight forwarder, to actually manage the mechanics of submitting that customs declaration. If you are going down this route, if this is something new for you, make sure you have appointed a freight forwarder. And it sounds self-explanatory, but make sure they have capacity. I say this, the Institute of Export did a survey. We are short of 50,000 clearing agents here in the UK to meet the expected demand. Now, another quick point on this one, very key, when you engage with a freight forwarder, you subcontract the process to them. You do not subcontract your legal liability. You remain legally liable to the tax authorities for all the accuracy in that declaration and also for any debt that arises from it. So make sure you are giving that freight forwarder accurate customs data. Not only have you got a compliance risk here, but the one thing the authorities like to do, if they don't like data, if they don't think it's correct, is they will hold goods at port. And often this can have a far more serious commercial and financial impact on you and the supply chain, as Nick was talking about before, than a couple of percentage more in tariffs. The government has also introduced an easement period, but for imports only, imports from the EU into the UK as of 1 Jan. They are allowing companies subject to certain criteria to delay submitting customs declarations for up to 6 months. This is an option for importers and one that you should consider, but bear in mind it's delay, it's not negate. You will still have to do a customs declaration at some stage, and therefore you still need to make sure you are keeping all the information to do this. The other challenges around customs is resource and knowledge. It is an area typically where there has not been much in-house resource or knowledge. The government has been trying to overcome this position by making millions of pounds available for customs training. So it's still out there. They have extended the fund and the deadlines until August of next year. So if you think you could benefit from this area, certainly worth putting an application in. And then finally, I think everybody will be thinking at the beginning of next year, how do we keep our goods moving? Then afterwards, in the medium, the long term, it's time to think strategic. It's time to think, how do we deal with these new supply chains, and how do we take these new costs out and minimize our new compliance risks? So things like bonded warehousing, things like processing release, we're going to see a raft of new free trade agreements coming in. So strategic sourcing, all of these things to consider once we get over the bump that is going to be 1 Jan. Thank you. Over to Julia.
Thanks, Juliet. So I'm now going to talk from an international tax and transfer pricing perspective. I am a tax operating model specialist, and so my team often includes people like Juliet, who's just talked about the customs area, and also I will often have VAT people in my teams helping bring an integrated tax approach to operating model and supply chain change. However, the first point that I'm going to mention, specifically with reference to preparations for Brexit, is a very pure corporate international tax point, but it is an important one to be aware of. And that is for those international groups that have cross-border cash payments, such as dividends, royalties, and interest. Be aware that some of those, the withholding tax treatment, can be reliant on the EU directives. It's expected that post 31 December, those directives will no longer apply to payments including the UK. And that then means double tax treaties between the UK and the European countries will kick in. Those double tax treaties don't always provide for nil withholding tax on dividends, royalties, interest. So definitely check if you have any of those sorts of payments. Some groups have accelerated and had payments made prior to 31 December, but in any event, it is something that you should keep an eye on and check before payments are made. Moving back to focus more on the topic for today's discussion for manufacturing and around supply chain, I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing, and Juliet there referred to the bump that's coming, the most important thing for me is that as business change is happening, as supply chains prepare, it's important to make sure that international tax and transfer pricing issues are considered as part of those change. It's important that decisions, particularly when they're being made quickly, are made with full understanding of the tax consequences. And interestingly, we're very much seeing businesses at the moment in react and resilience mode, sort of dealing with COVID-19 and contingency planning for Brexit. And actually quite a few of the solutions businesses are using apply to both business challenges at the moment. So just to mention a few areas that I've been advising on as part of manufacturing business contingency plan, I'm seeing a lot of new international inventory holdings and associated international activities. So for example, where there are businesses that might have had a single European distribution centre, as part of their contingency planning, they might be looking at an inventory holding in the UK and an inventory holding in Europe. COVID-19 has also meant we've seen more inventory holdings around the place to provide additional resilience. It's important to understand the local tax consequences of additional in-country activities and work through those with a particular focus on corporate taxable presence and any impact for transfer pricing. And one thing that I have noticed when groups look at new international inventory holdings, often you sort of see the start position being, well, we'll get a third party, they'll do everything, we won't have any rights of access. But actually what you find quite quickly is that associated in-country activities tend to accumulate when there's inventory there. So you have to start thinking about things like, well, could I have frequent international business visitors? Am I going to have somebody based in that warehouse? And making sure all of those are incorporated into your analysis of potential international corporate tax presence is important. The second area I want to mention is changes to flows relating to legal ownership of products. In the early days of Brexit planning, actually it was often regulatory requirements I saw that meant people needed to suddenly introduce a new, perhaps European or perhaps UK entity into their chain of legal title flow. Actually, more recently, I've seen the drivers being around international trade requirements, including customs and VAT. but questions to ask if there is a new legal entity, particularly a new international legal entity in the legal title float of product, is what is the appropriate transfer pricing for that new entity that's taking ownership to inventory. And it often requires a detailed understanding of the commercial substance underlying that arrangement. And then the final area that I just wanted to mention was watch out for transfers of potentially valuable assets that could attract exit charge. Customer contracts are a really good example. People looking at transferring customer contracts between a UK business and a European business. But actually, I've been working with clients over the past couple of years looking at areas that range from transfers of simple registrations and authorizations through to transfers of entire businesses, including IP. Very important to look at those and layer on the international tax and transfer pricing implication. And then the final area I wanted to mention is, at the moment, a lot of these changes are part of reacting to the very difficult circumstances we find, and resilience, just getting through the short term. But what I'm seeing, and I know Ollie is beginning to see as well, is I'm really beginning to see businesses think more about the future. What's the new normal going to look like? And how are we going to derive value and drive value in that area? Another area where I think it is really important to make sure that you're bringing in the consequences from your tax colleagues early, and that's whether it's corporate tax, customs, or VAT. I'm a real advocate for understanding the potential tax costs, risks, compliance requirements, and indeed any tax opportunities at a very early stage, so that as large business decisions are made, they're made with a good understanding of the after-tax consequences. Perhaps one of the biggest that I'm seeing at the moment is changes to organizational structure. I'm seeing a lot of groups review how their group is organized internally. And actually, it's very difficult to generalize on the themes because I'm seeing a huge variety of approaches. Nick mentioned near sourcing and insourcing, and I am seeing some groups say, actually, we think we want to retrench to a single territory. That gives us more supply chain security and a stronger areas of focus. But equally, I'm seeing other groups say, actually, no, we need more international touch points. That's either for our resilience, or actually that's because I now need a UK-based centre and a European-based centre. So I'm seeing people look at different geographic footprints and helping a number of clients work through the tax and transfer pricing consequences on that. And what's absolutely key here is the business changes aren't considered in isolation, but look through also through the lens of the support functions, which of course in my case is tax. So Ollie, at this point, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Julia. So, I mean, hopefully that was useful to everyone. Again, as I said, we weren't able to cover everything within the time, but these are some of the things we're really seeing clients talk about at the moment, and some key considerations for early next year and beyond. So hopefully it's given food for thought. I think if you draw the same conclusions from all this as I do, there's huge, it goes without saying, but there's a huge scope for significant disruption and potentially even disputes over the next 12 months or so. So understanding your position, whether that's from a supply risk exposure, contract risk, or tax perspective, is incredibly important. But it goes back to my earlier point around actually the businesses that will really thrive and come out the other side with their entire value chain intact as much as possible will be those that, yes, know their position, but actually communicate and collaborate as much as they reasonably can across that value chain. Now, I think just going back to the overview that Ben and James gave, it does paint quite a difficult picture and an outlook for the foreseeable future. And the lack of uncertainty isn't helping through Brexit, and it'll be uncomfortable for many businesses. But actually, just finishing on an air of positivity before I hand back to Bal, we've seen with COVID and time again that the businesses are incredibly resilient. And I'm in no doubt that they'll show the same level of agility and resilience to meet any challenges that arise post January the 1st. So I'll hand back to Bal now for any Q&A, but thank you for your time, and thank you to all the panelists for your contributions as well. Bal.
Thanks, Ollie. So we've had a couple of questions come through. So from Jeff, the question is, there's a big challenge to encourage investment at the moment. So whether that's from an R&D, net zero, productivity, or skills perspective amongst manufacturers, especially with the SMEs, when they are still so focused on just surviving. Are there any thoughts from both Ben and the BDO team in regards to encouraging investment? Ben, James, if we go to you first.
Shall I go first, and then James can jump in if he's got anything that he wants to add, or indeed anything that he'd like to correct. Always good to correct your boss in front of an audience, I find. So what we have been advocating in this area is a package of measures. We don't think that there's one thing that's going to work, and I appreciate the question how to focus on SMEs, but I think that we feel that actually there needs to be a portfolio of measures to affect the entire sector, because then there will be a knock-on benefit for SMEs in particular if we can focus on the whole sector. And some of these are more direct and some are less. We think it's absolutely critical that the government has a new industrial strategy. They've been talking about it for about a year. Its publication has been delayed. There's now a sense that consultation on that will begin next year. I appreciate that many people's eyelids start to close and boredom sets in very quickly when people suggest that the strategy is going to fix things. What I think is relevant about the strategy is not that in and of itself it's going to suddenly mean that firms go off and get the checkbook out. But what it does, I think, particularly for firms with overseas parents or firms that have got big strategic choices, is it sets out a very clear statement of intent by the government about how seriously they take the sector and what they're going to do to support it. I think the other thing is, and we'll see more of this in the budget next year, a sense of actual real spending in infrastructure that will help build confidence. And some of that's about physical infrastructure like roads and improvements to ports and so on, railways, HS2. Absolutely critical, we think, to encouraging investment is the digital infrastructure. We've been slightly worried that some of the budgets for the next level of broadband, of 5G, fibre in the ground, the kind of spending commitments have reduced, but some sense about the urgency of getting it done has increased. And Stephen, our Chief Executive, and I raised this point directly with the Chancellor of the Exchequer very recently. A critical factor for getting people to invest in digital transformation is going to be confident that where you're located, you've got access to 5G, you've got access to fibre broadband, because if you haven't, it doesn't instill the confidence needed to invest. And I think moving down the supply chain, some of the things like the Made Smarter initiative, which has now got really big money, will give firms the confidence, particularly SMEs who don't have large tech departments, don't have access to lots and lots of skills in-house. They will give people the confidence to separate the snake oil salespeople from the really, really good transformational products that are going to enhance their businesses. And finally, clearly, one of the things we'll be pushing the Treasury for in the budget is a sensible fiscal framework that incentivizes investment, provides the right tax framework and the right fiscal policy framework for investment. And that's one of the things we've been pushing for a while and will continue to push for. James may wish to add some more specific detail from an economist perspective to that.
I'll just, thanks, Ben. I'll just add two thoughts of mine that are sort of worrying when analysing the industry. And the systemic underinvestment in UK manufacturing, it predates the coronavirus pandemic quite significantly, and it will post-date it as well. So, and why is this a problem? That's a problem because it has harmed our international competitiveness in the UK manufacturing sector, and we're doing quite well despite this. However, compared to our partners, particularly in the European markets, our investment levels are significantly beneath them comparatively. And so now with the added onus of the potential disastrous or prosperous EU exit in 5 years' time, we'll look at that. However, it's just the time where UK manufacturing competitiveness needs to be excelling. But the real challenge to this in the new year, in the short term, is where they're going to get this capital from, because the credit environment for manufacturers in 2021 is going to be challenging, to say the least, especially compared to previous years. And as Jeff has pointed out, many are focused on just surviving. So those cash flows and that pent up cash or potential cash that has been put aside for investment has now been disposed of in favor of business continuity and placed into other avenues. So they'll need to get credit. And that's where we see an issue in mid-2021, is manufacturers will want to invest, and they'll know they need to invest in these new technologies. However, getting access to that finance will be a real issue. So what Ben's saying is very important. It's very important that the government puts that fiscal framework up, whether that's in credit support methods or in deductions towards tax deductions towards investment spend. But that really will need to be stimulated, and that is very much so in the interest of long-term manufacturing UK success. And it's something that needs to be a 5 to 10 year plan to get those investments back up so that we can see our competitiveness on the international stage assured. And it will also support a sustainable long-term recovery out of the pandemic that has affected the economy, and specifically the manufacturing economy so severely.
Thanks, James. Richard, anyone from the BDO team that wants to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just sort of add on to what James was saying. Clearly, you know, if you're an SME and you've got £1 to spend, are you going to spend it on survival, or are you going to spend it on investment? And it's really difficult. Clearly, you're going to spend it on survival right now. And that puts massive strain on just working capital more generally. And I think one of the themes that's going to be coming out over the next 3 to 6 months will be that just being really careful about your working capital management and where you put your pound, because every single pound matters at the moment. So I think that's fiscal support and other support the government can put in place and needs to be put in place sooner rather than later to allow businesses to at least start making some decisions which aren't as hand to mouth as they might be currently. I think the other thing that Ben was talking about was clearly there will be some infrastructure investment coming down the line from government, including things like the green agenda, etc. And the question is for businesses and manufacturing businesses, how easily or quickly can they pivot from what they're potentially currently doing to looking at alternative options of manufacturing different bits of kit, etc., to sort of respond to that. So it's going to be very tricky, I think, over the next 6 months. Everyone's going to have to be treading very carefully, and the more certainty that government can provide beyond the 1st of January, the better.
Thanks, Richard. And very conscious of time, we have had just one more question come through. So we have just over 2 weeks now until the end of the transition period. So from the panelist perspective, what would be the one thing that you would encourage businesses to prioritise? So if we start with the BDO speakers this time, so Ollie.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I mean, I guess it's a really difficult one with such a short space of time left, and I suppose the most obvious one from a supply chain perspective is just making sure you've got enough capacity within that supply chain to provide surety of supply in the short term. But I think beyond that, I'd really just hammer home the message I said earlier about communicating with both customers and throughout your supply chain as much as possible. With a lack of certainty that's coming from governments at this stage, you know, your only other source of understanding what the art of the possible is by communicating. So I think that's probably what I would focus on in the next few weeks.
Thank you. Nick?
Sorry, I was having technical difficulties. I suppose from my perspective, it's identifying your key friction points and understanding what they are, so you can, as Ollie said, communicate or be prepared to communicate and react to them and mitigate the impact. So whether that's blockages at ports, running out of materials, or whatever that might be, sort of have that forearmed approach to things.
Thank you. Juliet?
From my perspective, from a customer's perspective, it's back to those Incoterms. Understand what your responsibilities are, and if it includes engaging a freight forwarder to do those declarations for you, make sure you have that in place.
No, I agree with Juliet around, you know, the primary focus right now is customs and VAT, but be considering any major business supply chain changes very carefully. Make sure you think about them through the lens of international transfer tax and transfer pricing, so that you can pick up any potential costs, risks, etc. there.
Thank you. Then, James, is there anything you'd like to add to that question?
I mean, all the good answers have been used by the excellent team. So all I would say is, of course, make sure that you've secured the services of an excellent advisory partner like BDO, and that you're a member of an outstanding trade association like Make UK. Finally, the thing that comes up time and time again, talking to members, talking to government, and talking to people with real expertise alongside, very similar to the things that have been put down on the table already by your excellent speakers, is that one of the things is you really need to understand, if you're dealing in a complex product, where that product has come from. Actually, lots of firms are very focused on the bit that they add to that product in a supply chain, but knowing where it came from, whether it's an EU product, whether it's a non-EU product, things like rules of origin, which some of us have got very experienced about, others are really going to kind of stumble into, dependent on the nature of the trade deal, or indeed whether we have a trade deal or not. Really understanding the nature of the product that you're moving, its component parts, where they come from, is really, really key. And one of those things that I think lots of people have told us they're behind the curve on, and are now having to do a really quick catch-up job on.
Thank you. James, would you like to add anything?
I suppose from a more high level, I'll keep it very short, is that as businesses find themselves with such a unbeknownst challenge coming up, it'll be very important to not just ignore it come the start of January and i.e. just wait it out. It'll have your operations set so that whichever way the wind blows, or as obvious as it sounds, that you have that extra time, whether it comes to tariff codes or whether it comes to freedom of movement or whatever it may be, and whatever your business leans upon, to be proactive in watching how the movements are taking place within your industry and how you can best springboard that for your business moving out of the first quarter, which is going to be an uncertain, regardless of the outcome now in this 11th hour of the talks. So that's the best position from a high level businesses could align themselves.
Thank you, James. And finally, Richard, are there any final comments you want to add there?
Yeah, I think it's that classic of plan for the worst, hope for the best. And there's a famous quote, I can't remember who it comes from, which is, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So things will change. I think James is absolutely right. So you just need to be fleet of foot and agile in terms of how you respond to things. But the more planning you do, the better shape you'll be in.